Okay. Good morning and welcome to the 2021 virtual case competition sponsored by CAPSARC. So we're going to try to contain this entire program within 1 hour. And I'm going to go over a brief overview of the case competitions, the rules, and the prompt that the students received this year. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the USAEE administration for helping to do all the programming around this event, as well as acknowledging our sponsor, CAPSARC, which is also funding the awards this year. So it's $3,500 for the first place team and $2,500 for the second place team. Also, I'd like to acknowledge our 3 judges who have participated for the past couple months. In the first stage, they reviewed many submissions, written submissions from various teams, and are now here, or 2 of them are here to help judge the second stage, which is a presentation by each of the top 2 teams. So this year, the students received a prompt around carbon removal from a fictitious client called Carbon Removal Solutions and Ventures. So it's a strategic investment firm focused on driving innovation to accelerate an energy transition across every sector in the economy, in addition to having a research and development arm. So this client invests in startups attempting to commercialize direct air capture, long duration storage, and hydrogen. And so the main request of the client is around conducting a review of carbon removal technologies, or CDR, as many of the teams will probably abbreviate it to, and future global investment needs in CDR. So the prompt was, the students were given kind of a very high level prompt about various questions, poorly articulated questions from a fictitious client, in addition to a bunch of memos from the client and other consultants, and they had to sort through these to answer the client's questions. So the main case competition questions were, what are the country-specific CDR quotas to compensate for both historical greenhouse gas emissions and potential future emissions to 2050 under different cost allocation schemes? And so they were also prompted to understand how the quotas will be influenced by different cost allocation schemes based on principles such as responsibility, capability, and equality, or whatever else the team came up with. What is the least cost portfolio of CDR investments? So things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, reforestation, etc., given the different country level removal constraints and time variant technology costs. And the teams were also prompted to explore the key uncertainties such as technological readiness, cost, and removal potential, in addition to the influence of different equity principles on investment and deployment decisions. And the third main question that the teams were meant to respond to are, what are potential approaches to technological transfer of CDR, and quantifying the scale of technological transfers, including both the level of investment and the physical infrastructure. With the format of this case competition, the timing, each team will have 12 minutes to present, followed by 10 minutes of questioning from the judges and then the audience, if time allows. And the main judging criteria are responsiveness to the client need, quality of analysis, originality and insight, and the presentation. So we have 2 teams, one from Carnegie Mellon, which will present first, and the second from Princeton University, which will present second. And so with that, I'll turn it over to the first team to share.
All right, it looks like we're set to go. Can we just start, and you'll basically start the timer as soon as we start the talk?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction, Erin, and thank you everyone for attending our talk. We are Hertzbreakers Consulting, and we're here today to present our solution on carbon dioxide removal to Carbon Removal Solutions and Ventures. Next slide, please. Global climate models suggest that between 350 and over 1,200 gigatons of CO2 need to be captured globally before 2100 if we want to limit surface warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. There are some market-ready solutions for carbon dioxide removal, including afforestation and reforestation, and these present an inexpensive and effective investment option, particularly in developing countries. There are also more nascent technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, or BECCS, and direct air capture with sequestration, or DACS. And these can offer a unique opportunity for CRSV to grow the market space. It's currently very uncertain how the large financial burden of CDR will be distributed among different countries in a global decarbonization effort. In our talk today, we will be giving some estimates for regional costs and storage distribution, as well as providing a set of concrete recommendations for CRSV's future investment portfolio. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the potential for different CDR technologies remains highly uncertain. The graph that we see on the slide shows the technology cost on the y-axis and CO2 emissions abatement potential on the x-axis for a number of different CDR technologies. In our analysis, we're focusing on three: afforestation and reforestation, BECCS, and direct air capture. The others seen on the graph, biochar, soil sequestration, and enhanced weathering, are excluded from our analysis due to possible negative externalities or low expected sequestration potential. The plot shows the uncertainty and the costs. The red dashed uncertainty bars represent the full range of cost uncertainty across the literature, while the black represents the best estimate from one CDR meta-analysis. The plot only shows uncertainty and cost, and you can see the uncertainties are quite large. But there are also uncertainties around abatement potential, which are driven by land and water use constraints and the rate at which the technologies will reach commercial scale. And we'll talk about those uncertainties on a future slide. Next slide, please. Carbon dioxide removal provides worldwide investment opportunities for different developers to achieve climate targets. We estimate that the market size for CDR technologies ranges from billions to trillions of dollars per year. This enormous market opportunity gives developers worldwide investment opportunities to achieve these climate targets. Carbon dioxide emissions are a global issue, and we worry that there may be inaction due to free riders, as effective and realistic CDR allocations will, costs and investments in one country can affect the rest of the globe. We know that effective and realistic CDR allocations need to be established, and we'll discuss these allocations on the next few slides. Next slide, please.
All right, so while there's more general acceptance for the need for CDR technology, who will deploy this technology is contentious. As Katie just mentioned, CDR is expensive, and on top of that, these efforts will benefit the entire world. So there will inevitably be free riding. With this in mind, Pozo et al. Defined three principles by which country-specific quotas could be determined, which we'll review here briefly. The first is responsibility, which is shown in the map here on your right-hand side, and it assigns CDR quotas based on historic levels of emissions. The next principle is capability, which takes a different approach in allocating based on GDP, representing a country's ability to pay. The last is equality, which considers that everyone will benefit equally from these efforts and therefore allocates based on population counts of countries. Next slide, please. Now, we defined four other metrics by which CDR quotas could be allocated to expand the possibilities. The first is payback, which considers consumption-specific historic emissions, acknowledging that some countries produce more emissions than they consume and vice versa. That said, we find the resulting quotas to be highly correlated with those based on responsibility. The second is equity, which considers historic emissions per capita in an attempt to address the fact that some countries' populations have benefited more from emission-intensive activities than others. Next, we have practicality, which takes our capability principle one step further to only include OECD member countries in an attempt to characterize cooperative effort. And lastly, we define future, which considers both historic and projected future emissions. And this principle is the one shown here in the map on your right-hand side. As you can see, one of the biggest changes of this map from the previous one are the quotas for China and India, two developing countries with increasing emissions that are likely to continue barring technological or political intervention. Next slide, please. Now that we've reviewed several principles by which CDR could be allocated across the world, we need to ask ourselves, what do we as decision makers, stakeholders, or people in general most care about? As we can all probably agree, we likely care about more than just one of these principles. As a result, we employ a multi-criteria decision-making analysis, or an MCDM analysis, that allows us to combine different principles to different degrees, depending on what we want to prioritize. In a perfect world, we would learn these priorities via surveys, elicitations, and conversations, but with limited time and resources, we circumnavigate this process by using preference scenarios. Through these scenarios, we assign weights to multiple principles, depending on how much we want to prioritize them in the allocating process. We define 5 preference scenarios as shown here in the table on your right-hand side, and they go from being as simple as allocating thirds to the traditional principles or sevenths to each of those that we've talked about today. And they get more complex, such as using judgment to determine what holds countries accountable, what is quote unquote fair, or what is simply realistic. Next slide, please. And once we have defined our preference scenarios, we're able to follow through with this MCDM analysis. Now, MCDM can get very complex, but we keep it relatively simple, comparable to taking a weighted average. The results are shown here in the figure on your left-hand side, and there are several key takeaways we want to emphasize. The first is that most CDR will be covered by just a few quote-unquote countries, assuming the EU to be one country for this assessment. And this is the same across all preference scenarios. Consistently, 10% of countries will likely cover 75% of CDR, and only 4 will cover 50%. The next main takeaway is that the US has the top quota under every combination of principles, and the EU and China are consistently second and third. Now, one of our biggest takeaways through this work was the vast difference between the red bar you see for each country and the rest of the bars for that country, which demonstrates the large gap between what is realistic for CDR and what the literature or other principles may suggest. We want to emphasize to our client just how important it is to consider the landscape in the real world. What countries are willing to cooperate with these efforts, and how does that impact the distribution globally? And now I'm going to pass along the stage to Sean, who's going to talk about how these countries may meet their quotas.
Thanks, Luke. Now we'll move from the country allocation quotas to look at regional deployment constraints. We've considered 2 constraints on global and regional deployment potentials, which are geological storage and land use. So to begin with, land use is a significant concern for some net negative technologies, particularly for BECCS and afforestation, due to concerns around exacerbating food insecurity and impacts to local ecosystems. To minimize these impacts, we used estimates for the regional availability of marginal agricultural land, which is abandoned or degraded cropland. And from there, we've estimated the BECCS capacities. So for BECCS, we estimate net negative emissions of 1.5 to 7.7 gigatons of CO2 could be achieved annually across the globe, depending on assumptions around land productivity and the stringency of the definition used for marginal land. As you can see from the table, there are significant differences between the regions. Of the regions with sufficient available information, only South America would be able to meet their quota by the end of the century using BECCS alone, considering the 3 original quota allocation systems. This is one example of why multiple net negative sequestration technologies will be needed to achieve ambitious sequestration targets. Next slide, please. So now we look at the geological storage capacity as a limiting factor for CCS technologies, including DAF and BECCS. Despite there being some differences on how various national level estimates were created, aggregate estimates for the global geological capacity exceed estimated requirements by an order of magnitude, which strongly suggests that overall, this will not be a binding limitation. However, regional constraints do exist. As one example, Under the responsibility allocation, Saudi Arabia, Europe, Indonesia, and Russia were all identified as having insufficient capacity to meet their quotas, and regional constraints exist under other allocation principles as well. So, considering regional constraints on both land use and geological storage, it's clear that some regions will not be able to meet their quotas domestically. And considering the additional benefits of deploying CDR technologies in regions with lower cost, this strongly suggests that technology transfer and payment systems between countries will be required to meet global sequestration goals. Next slide, please. So our recommendations are that in developing and non-industrialized countries, CRSV should invest heavily in afforestation projects. In the US, the EU, and Canada, CRSV should invest in afforestation, BECCS, and DAC. CRSV should pursue DAC investments in regions where BECCS and afforestations are not suitable, or regions where the full suite of options will be necessary to meet decarbonization goals. In China and India, initial investments should focus on BECCS, as low carbon electric generation is critical to ensuring environmentally sustainable development and economic growth. And to conclude, carbon dioxide removal technologies will be required to play a critical role if the world is to meet climate change mitigation targets, as over 600 gigatons of CO2 will need to be removed from the atmosphere by the end of the century. Due to the nascent nature of BECCS and DAC, investments will be more profitable in countries with a favorable regulatory environment. And while cost and cumulative CO2 removal capacities remain uncertain, by focusing on several key markets around the world, CRSV can position themselves as a driving force in the CDR industry. Thank you for attending our presentation, and we'd welcome any questions.
Great, thank you, team. So I'll turn it over to the judges. Each can ask a question or 2 rounds of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience if time allows. So John, if you want to start us off with a question.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Firstly, just want to say I think you've done an excellent job on getting to grips with this. It's a complex problem, and it's all something that's it's got such a time scale. It's got the global consequences, and even attempting to allocate quotas. And indeed, I'm impressed by the additional 4 quotas, or the 4 metrics that you have developed yourself. So I think it's very good. I think my main focus in this is, and of course we're representing the client, CRSV, and in this case, when we are looking at global investments of high magnitude, of a whole range, the technology, when you say technology, it's hard to reconcile afforestation, reforestation with DAC or BEC, it's all so totally different. And the global environment, yes, there might be the opportunities, land use, there might be the willingness of certain countries to engage on it. Some might be, feel that, they really should rectify past emissions, etc. The question is really regarding uncertainties for an investor globally with a whole range of these opportunities. The investment uncertainty, it really seems to fall into 2 sort of big chunks for me. One is kind of the willingness of countries, nations, and given their populations, their culture, their society, their economic status, education, how willing will they be to participate? And secondly, the actual route of financing. How should CRSV, who essentially they are, they're going to engage with other financial institutions and funding opportunities, to participate, to facilitate this move forward. It's not all their own money that's going in for 50-year investment, etc. So regarding uncertainties, I think it boils down to what are the main say signposts or milestones, when and under what conditions should CRSV commence on a certain technology or in a certain geography or with a certain level of commitment. They're going to commit 100% entirely to China and DAC. You can go to ridiculous extremes, but are there any main signpost signals that you would recommend that the investor should look for to get into a certain place at a certain time in a certain technology, and vice versa? The other side is, if they are then in,
John, I'm going to cut you off and let the team answer the question. Because we have limited to 10 minutes. Team,
okay, right, fair enough. Yes, okay, please go ahead.
So I can take a stab at least the first part of your question about the different signposts that CRSV would need to be looking for to have some investment security. And we outlined this a little bit more in the report than I think we did in the presentation, but there's a huge emphasis on the regulatory environment. So if there's a clear signal from a country or a region within a country about commitments to net zero, that would be a good signpost, or any sort of carbon tax will make these kinds of investments much more economically secure than like a carbon tax-free regulatory environment. Additionally, the European Union's emissions trading scheme, there's been some discussion around adding net zero technology or net negative, emissions technologies into that. And that would also be a clear signpost to like the secureness of that investment. I don't know if anyone else on my team wants to add to that, but.
Yes, and when we're thinking about foreign direct investments, we also want to look at the government stability. How stable is the government? What are the labor costs? What are the land costs? And what are electricity prices looking like, especially for BECS and DACs, because DACs uses a lot of electricity and water. So if electricity prices are too high, it'll be very hard for DACs to become economically feasible and viable. For BECS, high electricity prices could be more beneficial because of producing electricity. So those are some of the main considerations we want to look at when looking at different countries to invest in.
Okay.
Thanks. So Mohammed, if you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, I think first of all, a great job. This is quite impressive what you guys have done, and I appreciate the presentation. It was of high quality, and I think you were guys quite you've done a great job of presenting the work there. And I think my initial question was revolving around the same issue that John had raised about what other non-economic aspect would you have considered to narrow the space of where you were going to go about your investments. And I was thinking more about the nationally determined contributions of different nations. And I know, Katie, I think you were talking about the net zero pathways. So I think you've kind of addressed the question already. So maybe I'll ask a different question. On the additional measures that you've added, I mean, the thought that crossed my mind immediately is that how do you go about assigning weights, and how do you ensure that you're not giving more weight to certain dimensions just because of the correlation or the cross correlation that exists among some of these additional weights that you've introduced, but they're just giving more weight to one dimension of the equation. So how do you overcome that challenge?
Yeah, I can take this question. Thanks for asking. Yeah, so we strategically went about assigning our weights, acknowledging that these correlations exist. So for example, our preference scenario for accountability, it takes into account both production and consumption emissions, but then we only account for considering, what should be really focused in on the emissions that a country has contributed, whether it's from production or consumption. Another good example is for the future scenario, which by itself includes both historic and future emissions. For the MCDM analysis, we only include projected future emissions. And so we strategically go about trying to not double count these very related principles. And so that's something that our analysis certainly takes into account. And I think that if there were to be a further assessment, there could be more more different ways of doing this, even more more detailed, and ensuring that they're not being double counted. But that is certainly a great point to raise, and we certainly do our best to address that.
Okay, great. So we probably have time for one more briefly posed question. So if John or Mohammed have a burning question, I'll leave it up to you to decide who asks.
Could I just, I'll just take the opportunity, since we just mentioned it. This potential for trading, as we say, similar to the EU carbon trading setup. I mean, it seems, quite logical that should be part of the whole. In fact, it may be the secret to the whole scheme to work. To what extent do you think, and how could CRSV engage in this trading of CDR opportunities? The facilitation between countries, they can do it and they pay for it. How could a private company engage in that sort of thing?
Yeah, so there's a few different options that CRSV could take. One would be foreign direct investments, like I talked about previously, or they're directly investing in that country or in companies within that country. That gives CRSV a lot of control over the products, as well as over the direction of how these technologies go forward. There's also foreign portfolio investments, so that gives CRSV a little bit less control, but they're still able to invest and have a return on their investment in the technologies. They can also partner, because a lot of these technologies are in their beginning stages, they could partner with local governments and local universities to kind of get beyond the ground doing research in these technologies. And this gives CRSV the opportunity to really get different benefits that countries are providing to push the technologies forward. There's also the options of doing a similar thing, but within research companies, to invest in these research companies and to get any type of benefit from whatever these companies commit to in the future, and any benefits that governments might have in different countries around the world.
Okay.
I'll add another potential avenue would be through existing offset markets, where they can distinguish themselves as a higher quality of offset that would justify what would probably be a higher price than what current offsets are going for internationally. So that would involve a little bit of product differentiation, basically, to say that theirs are higher quality and actually producing that negative benefit.
Okay, great. Thanks, team. We're at time now, and so we'll wait for the other team to come online and kind of move into the next presentation and question and answer session. So thank you, team.
All right. Just put this stuff together. Okay, I'm going to begin now. So hello, everyone. My name is Wilson Ricks. I'm a representative of Tiger Energy and Climate Solutions. And today I'm happy to present our special report on global solutions for carbon removal. This report was commissioned by Carbon Removal Solutions and Ventures with the understanding that CRSV aims to be a major player in carbon removal and seeks to understand the potential scale and geographic distribution of future CDR investments. As part of this effort, CRSV requested information on country-specific CDR quotas necessary to compensate for historical and future emissions, as well as an assessment of the fairest division of responsibility among nations. Also requested was an assessment of least cost portfolios of CDR technologies necessary for each country to meet its quota, as well as the global cost of CDR under these scenarios. And finally, an assessment of the importance of international technology transfers and foreign direct investments, as well as the potential scale of these investments. To meet these requests, TEX combined research and optimization modeling to address these questions across multiple future scenarios. Our analysis focuses on what we see as realistic scenarios for global CDR efforts in the latter half of the 21st century. Specifically, we propose a system for dynamically adjusting national quotas based on historical emissions and economic standing, as well as a method for assuring that poor countries are not overburdened by the quotas they're given. We analyze an array of promising CDR technologies and calculate costs and country-level biophysical limits for 176 countries around the world. And finally, we use optimization modeling to model a global CDR trading system, which optimizes the local deployment of these technologies, as well as the level of international investment necessary to minimize global cost.
It was important to us that the quotas we assigned be fair. And we define fairness in a few dimensions. First, in terms of responsibility, countries like the United States that have historically been heavy emitters should be responsible for cleaning up those emissions. In terms of capability, countries with high economic capability, and that might be a country like Qatar with a high GDP, should be responsible for their fair share of CDR. We also considered equality, wherein countries with high populations have a larger stake in the problem. But we wound up deciding that population levels in and of themselves were insufficient justification for heavy CDR onus. We did wind up including population as it relates to populations of impoverished persons, and I'll talk about how we do that in just a moment. In general, we decided that GDP and emissions should be weighted more or less evenly. We got those statistics from IPCC data for 176 countries, and we normalized them from 0 to 1. We wound up taking a weighted average of those statistics where the weights are determined by this curve here. For the most part, we wanted them to be weighted equally because if we overweighted GDP, we would not be incentivizing clean expansion. If we overweighted emissions, we might be overburdening some countries. That curve changes a little bit when we think about countries with very low GDP per capita, and that was our proxy for populations of impoverished persons. For those countries, because they still had a lot of mouths to feed, we wanted to make sure we weren't overburdening them. So we came up with this cubic function in which 75% of nations pay between 45 and 55% based on GDP and emissions. The bottom countries in terms of GDP per capita are scored more heavily based on GDP, just to make sure we don't overburden them. If we look at maps for 2020 and 2100 for our quotas, we wind up seeing that CDR is more evenly spread out in the year 2100. And we'll describe in a couple of moments a CDR trading framework that we established in order to allow that to happen, as quotas are dynamically adjusted every 5 years.
So to allow each country to meet its CDR quota, we analyzed the range of possible CDR technologies available, ranging from both the natural solutions to more technological options across varying levels of maturity. And we settled on 5 technologies that we thought were especially promising and scalable. These being afforestation and reforestation, bioenergy with carbon capture, BECCS, direct air capture, DAC, soil carbon sequestration, and enhanced weathering. We excluded biochar from this list because we decided that it was likely more expensive than BECCS and competed for the same resources. And we also excluded ocean alkalinization, which is a technology with large potential, but also very high ecological risks, which we think should only be used as a last resort. Across all these technologies, there was pretty high uncertainty in cost and scalability, but based on an assessment of the available scientific literature, we calculated likely costs and country-level biophysical limits for each of these for 176 countries around the world. Using these biophysical limits, which are of course unevenly distributed, we decided that the best way to ensure efficient use of global CDR resources was through a global CDR trading system. By trading CDR on a global market, we promote system efficiency and thereby minimize global costs and maximize social good. So each country can meet its limit either by performing CDR locally using the resources available to them, or if there are more cost-effective options somewhere around the world, it can essentially purchase CDR credits on a global market, much like a carbon trading market, effectively investing in CDR in foreign countries. We modeled this framework using an optimization model written in Julia, which takes in national quotas, local CDR costs, and local biophysical limits as inputs, and outputs suggested optimal CDR portfolios for each country, both in terms of the CDR performed locally and the CDR funded by that country, and seeks to minimize global costs. Within this model, each country has an artificial hurdle rate that biases it towards performing CDR locally first. The model also considers things like biofuels trade internationally and land use allocation decisions between bioenergy with carbon capture and afforestation, which compete for the same land uses in some cases. We analyzed 3 primary removal goal scenarios, these being 700 gigatons, 1400 gigatons, and 1700 gigatons, corresponding to different goals for global temperature rise over the 21st century. And across these cases, we identified a clear hierarchy of technology priority. So in each case, we see that you start out with technologies that are by far the cheapest, these being natural technologies like afforestation, soil carbon sequestration. Then as these hit their biophysical limits, to meet your removal goal, you have to invest in more expensive technologies like BECCS, enhanced weathering, and finally direct air capture, which is the most expensive of the technologies we investigated. In terms of costs, we find that in our reference case, CDR is a $4 trillion a year industry, which of course means a large potential market for companies like CSRV. We find that this cost actually varies quite a bit depending on the removal goal. For example, going from 700 to 1400 gigatons brings you, increases costs by almost 4 times. And that's because the expense of these high-tech options really starts to kick in once you hit the biophysical limits on the more natural low-tech options. We find that uncertainty in the costs and biophysical limits of technologies has a large effect on outcomes. And of course, there is a large uncertainty for all of these relatively immature technologies. The most extreme uncertainty comes from direct air capture, which is notable for being likely the most expensive technology, but also the one with the least biophysical limits, and also one with a very high uncertainty range and costs. We see that across the range of possible DAC costs that we investigated, the global cost of CDR ranges from $1.5 trillion a year to $5.5 trillion a year, just based on changes in the cost of direct air capture. We also see that it changes the optimal allocation of land use between afforestation and BECCS. In cases with a lower DAC cost, afforestation is generally preferred on land where both can be performed because it's far, far cheaper than BECCS. However, in cases with very high direct air capture costs, BECCS is actually preferred on those lands because it makes more efficient use of that land. You get greater sequestration per hectare. And that effectively pushes off the point at which you have to rely on the far more expensive direct air capture. We find that international investments are extremely important for ensuring global cost-effective CDR efforts. In our reference case, foreign direct investments, that is countries that are effectively purchasing CDR on a global market or investing in CDR in foreign countries to meet their own quotas, those investments account for 16% of global spending. However, if we disallow them and force each country to invest only in CDR within its own borders, global costs increase by 17%, which effectively means that each dollar spent on CDR internationally reduces global costs by $2. Without foreign direct investments, countries are forced to rely on more expensive options at home when cheaper CDR exists abroad. So these effectively allow us to more efficiently use the global portfolio of CDR resources, which is unevenly distributed. Moving on to our final recommendations. We believe that CSRV should push for internationally equitable solutions, specifically in the area of national CDR quotas to encourage global buy-in. This is because countries are more likely to participate in a global CDR effort when they believe that their burden is fair and that they're not being overburdened. We also believe that CSRV should work to carefully characterize the performance and deployment potential of each of these CDR technologies, because decreasing model uncertainty will be key to getting a better picture of what the future market looks like. One thing we can say for certain, though, is that natural CDR solutions like afforestation and soil carbon sequestration should be deployed first, because these are far more cost-effective than the essentially higher tech solutions available. Among those higher tech solutions, we find that direct air capture has a large effect on global outcomes in the latter half of the 21st century, and that investing in R&D to minimize the cost of direct air capture, which is notable for having high costs, but also virtually unlimited potential, is very important to minimizing global costs. Finally, we believe that CSRV should try to foster the creation of a global CDR trading system with universal accounting practices that can be trusted, because this will ensure the most efficient use of unevenly distributed CDR resources around the world. Thank you very much, and we would be happy to entertain questions.
Great, thank you, team. So this round we'll start off with Mohammed, if you want to pose the first question.
Sure, and first of all, apologies. I'm sitting in a conference here, so apologies about all the background noise coming from my end. First of all, thank you very much for a job well done. I do appreciate the level of in-depth analysis that the team has done in putting together the model and doing the assessment. So I guess the first question that comes to mind, and maybe you've already alluded, I mean, you kind of touched on it toward the end, Wilson, but I wasn't quite sure how you guys have handled how the cost would evolve over time. Are you guys just taking into consideration the fact that we would anticipate the cost of some of these technologies to drop over time? How is that being considered in your modeling framework? Let me pause this question, and then I'll probably come back with another question later on. You can address that one.
Okay, so our model was a static model, so it only considered basically a single investment decision for each technology over the last 50 years of the 21st century. And each technology, the cost that we aligned on was what we assumed to be a reasonable future projected cost based on assessments in the literature for each of these technologies. So these are supposed to be at scale future costs rather than say current costs for each technology. If we were to go more in depth, we could potentially do a year by year deployment approach, and then maybe have a learning curve analysis where technologies get, say, cheaper as they're deployed at greater scale. But in this model, we took a simplified approach that just had a single investment year with projected costs.
Okay, thanks. John, you want to go?
Yeah, okay, yes, thanks very much. It's John here. I must say, I think you've done a great deal of depth of investigation, and particularly the modelling is impressive. Yes, I have a sense that your work seems to be rather of the sort of abstract or almost philosophical type of angle, whereas the brief for me is CRSV are seeking, indeed, they're seeking this sort of work that you've done, but they want to know what are the recommendations for them who are, you've got to say, a hard-nosed strategic investor looking at CDR. It's one opportunity, you know, there's other opportunities, nothing to do with climate. So what are the real solid, where should they put their money, bearing in mind the risks and uncertainties, and how should they actually proceed? You know, I mean, one example you can say, DAX, you can say high technology, very expensive, research needs to be done, or then afforestation, whatever. What exactly are you saying for them to do?
Well, I think in the near term,
I was gonna, if I may add to this question that John raised, because I had a similar thought, and maybe if you guys can also elaborate, since you've done quite a bit of a detailed job where we've captured country level information in your analysis, I was wondering if you can also comment what would that mean for in different geographies in different regions. So I would appreciate if you can give some specificity in that regard as well. So thank you.
Yeah. So starting with John's question, I think our recommendation for like more near term is that if CSRD wants to be a player in carbon removal, that the best, most cost-effective near-term options are in more natural solutions like afforestation and soil carbon sequestration. And so those are the technologies that you can get the most bang for your buck out of. That should definitely be deployed first. In terms of if they want to be a player in the long term, and of course, this is like a very long-term analysis. So immediate investments probably will not be the same kind of investments that you'd want to make, like, in the latter half of the 21st century. We're not recommending that they try to start a global CDR trading framework right now, because it's really not something that is relevant in the 2020s. But in terms of making sure that CDR becomes effectively a cost-effective option long-term, and if they want to be a player in it, direct air capture is definitely an important technology to be investing in. It's lowering its costs. It's really the only one that doesn't have a hard limit, because geologic sequestration has such large potential around the world. And so direct air capture is probably going to be one of your best bets in terms of long-term, large-scale CDR deployment. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on concrete recommendations.
Yeah, I think it might be worth turning as well in terms of the geographic question to our deployment by region graph, Wilson, because that's something we looked into here, right? Deployment is going to depend a lot on the geographic capabilities of each region that we're looking at. So sort of looking more specifically, this is what we tend to see.
Yeah, and so like, for example, here, we have results by individual countries. We decided to simplify it down to just regions for this plot. But here, for example, and this is in terms of CDR deployed in a location rather than CDR funded by countries in that location. So in South America, there's very high potential for reforestation. Of course, you've got the Amazon there. And so you see, of course, a very high investment in that approach in South America, whereas, say, in East Asia, it's not as big of a factor compared to bioenergy with carbon capture, which is the biggest resource there, because there's, I guess, a lot of potential farmland available. So we see uneven distribution of these technologies, and that kind of reemphasizes the importance of being able to trade CDR on a global sense, because the quotas are not distributed in the same way as the available technologies. And so being able to invest in CDR where it exists is important.
Okay, great. Thank you, team. So
Aaron,
John or Mohammed, do you want to ask him? Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so just to build on, since we're looking at this slide, if you were to take into consideration, I mean, I know you guys have been looking at the cost and the potential in different regions, but if you were to consider other non-economic dimensions to your calculation, in terms of the awareness of these technologies, the acceptance of these technologies, the willingness to invest, or the stability of the governments and what have you, how would you anticipate how different your results would be, and how would that factor into your recommendation here? Just in general sense, I'm not looking for a lot of specifics here, but how would you go about addressing those dimensions in your analysis?
I think the the hurdle rates might end up being higher in real life than what we set them to. I mean, you can see in our optimal system that there's a lot of money flowing around the world. For example, the United States is spending $100 billion a year funding CDR in foreign countries. And then countries like Russia are receiving a lot because I guess they have a lot more farmland than their quota requires. And I think that countries, we include the hurdle rates to assume that countries would, want to spend money in their own borders and like fund their own economies and populace before spending it abroad, even if there were cheaper options abroad. But I suspect that that bias might be greater in real life than even we assume it to be here, and that countries might, even if they would only invest in CDR abroad if it was significantly cheaper than what was available to them.
Okay, great. We have time for one very brief question, if John or Mohammed has another.
Yeah, can I just ask a real quick one now? Right now, of course, we've got this COP26 conference going on and sort of, some extent mixed signals, but perhaps, and, the whole issue of global cooperation, collaboration, this problem requires that. How risky, for an investor, a serious investor, as we're looking at, in any of these solutions, is it really a very risky business, this CDR, or do you find it's not much different from other sort of investments?
It's true that this is inherently a global problem that requires a global solution. I think in terms of the risk associated, I think it's going to depend a lot on the technologies considered, right? Things like DAC that we saw have, I guess, relatively more risk because their changing cost changes the cost of the entire system. Wilson, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that as well, but.
Yeah, I think the highest risk, at least for a company like CRSB right now, is just that any global CDR effort is likely far in the future, because right now, of course, we're focused on mitigation, which is far easier than carbon removal. And so I don't think the global community will start to become really engaged with carbon removal until economies are nearing net zero emissions. And so I think that'll be something that happens necessarily like in the latter half of the 21st century, which means that any investments right now are inherently risky. But I think if this kind of global effort begins to become more established in the future, it would be good for a company to be positioned at the forefront of it.
Okay.
Great, thank you, team. So we're at time, and this is the conclusion of our program. The teams or the judges will deliberate offline, and results will be kind of announced within the next few days or week or so. So thanks for everyone from attending, the judges and the teams. Have a good day.
Thank you.